Today on Under the Big Tree, creating a modular synth for live performance Part 4, Clocks, Pulses, and Musical Time. Welcome to Part 4 of our series on building a modular synthesizer for live performance. Today, we're going to get into the heartbeat of the system, the master clock, and the streams of pulses that derive from it. Music is an art form that moves forward linearly in time, and time is the very foundation of all music. We live our entire lives within a series of cycles, from the beating of our hearts to the cycles of days, weeks, months, seasons, and years. And music lives as we do, unfolding and existing in cycles within cycles. Those cycles are often plain as day, as a traditional rock song might have a slavish structure of rhythms and sections like verse and chorus. Or, in the case of some experimental or drone music, the cycles are obscured behind the fact that there might be no discernible rhythm, or even notes. But even in those outside cases, the music starts, develops over a time, and ends. It has a duration. It exists in musical time. And musical time is what this episode is about. We will do a quick refresher course on tempo, subdivisions, meter, swing, and polyrhythms in relation to modular synths, and look at how to set up your system to use different subdivisions to drive different sequencers. We'll explore the notion of resolution with respect to sequence length, and look at clock dividers as well. I love the idea of having access to the very fast and the very slow at the same time within your system. And the beauty of modular is that you can indeed construct something like that with just a few modules and a little experimentation. Thinking of pulse streams inside these types of systems reminds me of looking at the inside of an analog watch. You have all these different gears that are turning at different rates, but all are connected together, operating at multiples or subdivisions of the master pulse. You can follow the path of any of the gears, or you can observe them all working together in tandem, creating a wonderful little world of intermeshed movement. So with that overview in mind, let's jump into some musical definitions that we will need to know in order to approach rhythm on a modular system. Music is broken into bite-sized little chunks called measures or bars. Each bar is between about 1 and 4 or 5 seconds in duration. For example, one bar of a typical dance groove with 4 beats to the bar at a tempo of 120 is exactly 2 seconds in length. Musical patterns can be 1 bar long, but that's not usually long enough to express a musical idea. They're often organized in powers of 2. A rhythm pattern might be 2 or 4 bars, the bridge of a song or a complete musical phrase might be 8 bars, and the verse or chorus of a song is often 16 bars. A whole pop song could conceivably be as short as 64 bars, although something more like 128 bars would be more typical. Music generated by modular synthesis typically works in much longer, more abstract time frames than your typical pop song. But much of it is deeply rooted in the repetition of patterns, and hearing those patterns evolve over time. Measures are built of beats, or pulses. A single measure is most commonly 4 beats long, but measures of 2, 3, 6, and 12 beats are also seen all the time. We'll touch on this more when we talk about meter in a moment. What's really important for our discussion is the notion that there are different durations of notes that the measure can be divided into. And those durations are divisions of each other, starting with the longest note and getting smaller and shorter. These different durations are called subdivisions and are directly related to the multiple pulse streams that we're going to use in our modular systems, as you'll see in a minute. The longest note division is called a whole note, and it is defined as the length of a measure. Whole notes are pretty long. In a measure that is 4 beats long, the whole note would be worth 4 beats. Dividing it in half, we get half notes, which are worth 2 beats. So, dividing in 2 again, we go from the half note to the mighty quarter note. I would say that the quarter note is really the fundamental pulse of music. It is short enough in duration that we really feel it as a rhythm, but it is not so short that there are too many of them to keep track of in a bar. I like to think of our heartbeats as quarter notes. The most rudimentary rhythms can be built of just quarter notes. We often hear techno music breakdowns where the only rhythm is a kick drum being played every quarter note. Alternating between kick and snare on quarter notes is also very common. But this is only the beginning. Let's divide in half again. Now we go from quarter notes to eighth notes. There are 8 eighth notes in a measure. When building a melody, you probably have more eighth notes than any other duration. In our really simple rhythmic example of quarter notes, we can add much more propulsion by playing a hi-hat on every eighth note. Remember when I was talking about cycles within cycles and that watch mechanism? Well, here it is. We now have one aspect of a rhythm based on quarter notes and another aspect based on eighth notes. This idea will be represented in our modular by having access to quarter note and eighth note pulse streams from different outputs that can be used to trigger different modules at the same time. So moving on, we can divide eighth notes in half, which gives us, wait for it, 16th notes. 16th notes are pretty darn fast and are usually the shortest duration notes we'll be dealing with on a practical level. You can keep dividing to get 32nd, 64th, and even 128th notes, but in reality those are so short that they are perceived more as a blur of notes than anything else. Okay, almost done with subdivisions. We can divide up beats into other fractions as well. Most commonly, we divide a quarter, eighth, or 16th note in 3, which gives us triplets. Quarter note triplets are perceived by me as a kind of pulling or slowing down of the time for a movement. Eighth note triplets are sprightly, and I think of them as adding extra energy to an eighth note melody, or creating a really cool counter rhythm to what we hear in our basic rhythm. 16th note triplets are for showing how fast you can play your guitar. Bear in mind that you can also divide up notes into fifths, sevenths, 11ths, 13ths, etc. But anything past about sevenths or septuplets just sounds like a blur of notes again. The last rhythmic subdivision we're going to touch on is the dotted note. A dotted note is defined as taking a note and adding another note half as long to its duration. So a dotted quarter note is made of adding a quarter note and an eighth note, and could thus be thought of as being a beat and a half long. A dotted eighth note is made of an eighth note plus a 16th note, and so forth. Dotted notes are just awesome, and are critical in adding rhythmic interest to a groove or melody through a process called syncopation. They are used constantly in all genres of music, particularly jazz and funk. So now we have all these subdivisions that are musically related to each other. But how do we specify the overall speed of a piece of music? Through the concept of tempo. The tempo is the bridge between musical time and clock time. It specifies how long a beat actually lasts for, or the duration between beat onsets. Because these different subdivisions of musical time are all related to each other, when you increase the tempo, all the quarter notes, eighth notes, and so forth decrease in duration linearly. So let's say that you have a tempo where a quarter note lasts for half a second, and thus an eighth note lasts for a quarter of a second. If you double the tempo, then a quarter note now lasts for a quarter second, and an eighth note now lasts for an eighth of a second. Tempo is specified in beats per minute, or BPM. For our purposes, we'll say that this is the number of quarter notes that play in 1 minute. The normal range of tempos is between about 40 beats per minute, which is extremely slow, and 180 or 200 beats per minute, which is really fast. I've seen pieces go as fast as 270 beats per minute, but those are the exception, not the rule. An average tempo for a pop or dance tune is between 100 and 120 beats per minute. 120 BPM is easy to work with because it's very common, and you can do the math conversion between clock time and musical time easily. If 120 quarter notes happen in 60 seconds, then that means that each quarter note lasts for half a second, or 500 milliseconds. Each eighth is 250 milliseconds, and each 16th is 125 milliseconds. A dotted eighth note at 120 BPM would be an eighth plus a 16th, or 325 milliseconds. And a half note would be the same duration as 2 quarter notes, or 1 second. This means that a bar of music that is specified to have 4 beats would last for exactly 2 seconds. You don't normally have to do this much math when dealing with musical time. It's just good to know about it, and to get a rough idea of how long notes last for. In general, in Modular, you'll be specifying a master tempo via a special clock that allows you to dial in a tempo, or by ear from an LFO or other slow pulse source. Once that quarter note is specified, then the rest of the subdivision pulse streams are created with modules that are called clock multipliers to create faster subdivisions than the quarter note, or clock dividers to get slower subdivisions. These devices allow you to create musical events in your modular that are related to each other in time, from blurs of 128th notes all the way to events that trigger once every 128 measures. So now that we're thinking about continuous streams of pulses, we need to figure out how to group them into measures. An ongoing stream of clicks is formless and without shape. Once we mentally divide those clicks into measures, we impose a structure based on repetition that lies at the foundation of our piece. Meter is the term for how many beats make up our measure. We already talked about measures that are made up of 3 or 4 quarter notes in duration, and those are by far the most common choices. But they're not the only ones by any means. To start with, we can actually use numbers in the denominator other than 4. Both 2 and 8 are common, and just like equivalent fractions, 3/4 and 6/8 have the same duration. However, they have a different feel, which we will touch on in a moment when we discuss accent patterns. When the denominator is 2, a half note represents the beat, and when the denominator is 8, the beat stands for an eighth note. But again, for modular systems, I think that focusing on having a quarter note represent a beat, thus having 4 as the denominator, is fine for most purposes. You can have odd time signatures, where the numerator is usually a prime number greater than 3, such as 5, 7, 11, 13, and so forth. The larger the number of beats in a measure, the more difficult it is to hear the repetition, and so in practice, odd time signatures are most frequently built on 5 or 7 beats. You can also have compound time signatures, where bars of different lengths alternate back and forth. For example, a bar of 6 quarter notes followed by a bar of 7 quarter notes would result in a time signature of 6 plus 7 over 4 for a repeating cycle length of 13 beats. Compound time signatures make it easier to feel the groove by breaking a large number down into 2 smaller ones. So, how do you feel a time signature? You can have repeating patterns, of course. A repeating sequenced melody or kick-snare combination can clue you in. But there's another important thing to think about that comes naturally on many instruments, but involves a bit more work and forethought on modular, namely accent patterns. Accent patterns divide a rhythm into strong beats and weak beats. Strong beats are louder and have more emphasis than weak beats, and can happen anywhere in the bar to help define a particular rhythm. But most often, the downbeat, or the first beat of the bar, is a strong beat. It is accented. Even if you don't have any other accents in the bar, that accented downbeat will tell the listener what the time signature is, and give them an anchor to hold on to. In a 4/4 groove, beats 1 and 3 are often accented, while beats 2 and 4 are not. You can also accent different notes in the eighth note patterns of a hi-hat to start adding flavor and subtlety to your groove. So how does all this relate to rhythms created on a modular? Well, we can derive any particular beat by using something like the Depfer A160 clock divider connected to an A161 clock sequencer, which breaks out each beat of the bar to a different jack. By plugging into beat 1, you now have a distinct pulse that fires on the beginning of each bar, giving you your downbeat. But what about the sound itself? Well, there are plenty of drum modules, such as those from Tip Top Audio and Hex Inverter, that have separate accent inputs. A trigger received there will cause the sound to be louder and brighter than the regular triggers. But you can also do it yourself through adding voltage to a VCA, brightness to a filter cutoff, and so on. Finally, we can't leave the subject of accent patterns without touching on the concept of syncopation. Syncopation involves accenting the upbeats of a bar rather than or in conjunction with the downbeats. It creates surprise and freshness to the rhythm. There would be no jazz or funk without syncopation. And now we get to polymeters and polyrhythms. Poly means more than one, and a polymeter is just what it sounds like. 2 or more different meters playing at the same time. For example, you could have 2 sequencers that receive the same clock pulse, so their notes trigger at the same time. However, one of the sequences could be in 4/4 and another one could be in 5/4. Their melodies and rhythms would drift apart from each other and then would sync up again every 20 beats, because 20 is the least common multiple of 4 and 5. This can create a kaleidoscope of interesting material as we hear the separate melodies crossing over each other. What would happen if you combined these 2 sequences and then used that summed voltage to trigger a melody? you'd have a single voice with a complex melody having a length of 20 beats. Now, let's think about 3 different sequences all playing at the same time. Now the number of beats that are played before the whole thing repeats is the least common multiple of the 3 sequences. So let's use prime numbers and say that you have 3 sequences of 3, 5, and 7 beats. 3 times 5 times 7 is 105 beats before the sequence repeats itself. And let's up the ante a bit, using sequences of 7, 11, and 13 beats. Now, the pattern repeats after 1001 beats, effectively creating a phasing kaleidoscope of ever-shifting emergent melodies and rhythms. Modulars are just great for polymeters because of the ease of creating parallel, unrelated note streams. Polyrhythms are a bit of a different beast. Instead of having the notes in synchronization by having the same duration but looping in different time signatures, polyrhythms are about keeping the bar lines in sync, but having different note lines playing at different unsynchronized subdivisions within those bars. When you play quarter note triplets at the same time as regular quarter notes, you're creating a polyrhythm. The first note of each line starts at the same time in each bar, but the rest of the notes are not even multiples of each other, and so they sound out of sync. This effect is enhanced when you have, say, 7 beats playing against 4 beats. It can be really tough for humans to play together accurately like that, but it is child's play for our modular overlords. A clock divider can just as easily divide a measure into 7 beats as 8 beats, which is all you need to start exploring this really weird side of rhythm. The last stop on our musical overview of rhythm is swing. Swing is a subtlety, but it is a foundational aspect of the sound of both jazz and funk styles. The idea is this: rather than having all beats of the bar be divided by exactly the same duration, which can lead to a stiff and robotic groove, we adjust some beats to start a little earlier or later. Typically, we hear this in the snare on 2 or 4, and on the hi-hats in 8th notes. The amount that you delay or advance those alternating beats are very much an individual trademark and have a huge effect on the perception of whether a rhythm grooves or not. The amount of swing you add to the rhythm can be nearly imperceptible or enough that the pulse is distorted enough to sound like every other beat sounds like a triplet or a dotted note. Swing is a feel thing, and when you have it right, it makes the rhythm so much more hip. Definitely worth exploring in modular. Okay, now that we've condensed 5,000 years of musical knowledge into 5 minutes, let's focus more closely on how it relates to modular systems. It all starts with the master clock of your system. This is whatever device you have that generates the fundamental pulse that everything else ultimately triggers from. It could be something fancy like a drum sequencer where you can set the tempo by dialing a number, or a MIDI to CV converter, which would allow your modular to slave to a pulse generated by your digital audio workstation. Or it could be something as simple as an LFO set to a square wave shape. In my case, I use a Pamela's Workout as my master clock, but there are endless other choices as well. Let's make this easy on ourselves and say that the fundamental pulse is always a quarter note. It doesn't have to be, but that duration is a good middle ground, so let's use it. Once you have your fundamental pulse of quarter notes, you can use clock dividers and clock multipliers to derive additional pulse streams at different subdivisions of the fundamental. They will all be operating at the same tempo, but you will now have easy access to both slower and faster events that are on the same grid as our quarter note pulse. Let's see how. A clock multiplier will multiply the pulse, thus giving you a new pulse stream that is faster than the stream coming into it. So if you send quarter notes to a clock multiplier, then you could derive 8th notes, 16ths, 8th note triplets, etc. A clock divider does the opposite. It will create longer multiples of the pulse it receives. So a quarter note input will give you half notes, whole notes, even clocks that take 8 or 16 bars between beats. And of course, since electronic devices like hard math, there is no reason that you can't multiply or divide your fundamental pulse by 7 or 13 or any other multiple that the hardware supports. That's how you can get polyrhythms out of your modular. The big takeaway here is to think of your fundamental pulse as the heartbeat of your whole system. You may never hear it explicitly, but it will be there at the foundation, creating a sturdy structure that you can build on. So what can you do with these multiple simultaneous pulse streams? Let's answer that by thinking about the resolution of step sequencers. You can think of your hardware sequencer as having a kind of resolution, just like sampling rate or image resolution in a camera. But the sequencer's resolution, at least if we're talking about a non-computer-based modular sequencer, has a very low resolution. There are a small number of finite steps in an analog sequencer, anywhere from 3 to about 32, and so you have to make each one count. You can think of it like this. The larger the subdivision, the longer the sequence lasts before repeating, but with the trade-off that it has less detail. Here's what I mean. Let's say you have an 8-step sequencer. If you send a quarter note pulse stream into it, that means your pattern lasts for 2 measures, since there are 4 quarter notes in a measure of 4/4. If you send an 8th note stream into it, then the pattern only lasts 1 measure, since there are 8 eighth notes in a measure. Sounds like quarter notes are better, right? But here's the catch. The pulse is effectively the resolution of your sequencer. If the grid is set to quarter notes, then you can't trigger any notes of your pattern on any subdivision except for quarter notes or larger, like half notes. This certainly detracts from the complexity of the rhythm that you can program. If, on the other hand, you send 8th notes into your 8-step sequencer, then you can program your rhythm to the resolution of 8th notes. This opens up the door to syncopation and hipper groove patterns, but at the expense of the length of the repeating pattern being only 1 bar long. So let's turn this weakness into a strength by sending different pulse subdivisions into different sequencers and having them trigger different sound modules. For example, if you're going for a straight-ahead quarter note groove for the kick and snare, you could trigger them from a sequencer that is running from a quarter note pulse stream, allowing you to, say, have an accent pattern that is 2 bars long. You can then use an 8th note pulse for the hi-hat, having a more complex 1-bar pattern for that instrument. Okay, let's finally take a look at what it is that I put together within my live case for clock distribution. Sometimes I'll just wing it and put modules together, but I knew that what I wanted was very specific and that I had some specific modules, and so because I wanted to get it right, the first thing that I did was to make a drawing on paper with the materials that I had to try to figure out how it is that everything would work. And once I did that and then I set it all up, it turned out to work perfectly. So the whole thing starts with my Pamela's work out here, where there are 8 separate outputs that I am assigning to different pulses. The first one is quarter notes, then 8th notes, 8th note triplets, 16th notes, and then 5, 6, and 7, and 8 are used for my 2 swing circuits, for my quarter note and my 8th note swing circuits. And so the way that I did that was that both 5 and 6 output half notes, but they're offset from each other by a quarter note, meaning that one of the 2 of them will be triggering every quarter note. And the same thing with 7 and 8. They're both outputting quarter notes, offset by 1/8 note from each other, and so you're going to get these 8th note, you're going to get continuous 8th notes, and you can see that that's what I wrote down here. That's what I programmed Pamela to do. Now, the 2 offsets, 6 and 8, the 2 offset notes are going here into a trigger delay, a Dupfer trigger delay, in which I changed the capacitors to smaller ones so that it would be more sensitive and have a smaller range. From there, these 2 each go into an OR circuit, because as it turns out, you can just use a regular simple logical OR circuit to be able to sum pulses together, and it works. So from there, I take 5 and 6, the other two halves of the swing circuit, and run them into the 1/4 inch and the 1/8 inch sections of the OR circuit separately. So the nomenclature that I decided to use here was anything that's a circle is an output directly that I can plug in to sequencers and things later on. Anything that's just marked is merely an input of some sort, or it's something that's already being used as part of the circuit. So we can see here from this circle that you'll be able to grab a 1/4 inch swing output right from there. Not that 1/8 inch swing though, because it's going into a mult. So let's move on to this mult. This buffered mult, and I used a buffered one to try to make sure that the pulses would be as tight as possible and not get pulled down by each other. So this is my main hub. The first section of the buffered mult here is all of our straight quarter notes, because since I said the quarter note is going to be the fundamental pulse of our system, that's the one that we want to be able to have the most access to. So you'll see in a minute that I use it to drive other things, but in addition I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 separate open outputs that can be used to drive any sequencer directly. In addition, I'm using a portion of the buffered mult to be able to drive eighth notes. So I've got 1, 2, 3 straight eighth note pulses you can grab. And then down here, the eighth note swing, I have 3 of those. The reason being that I think I'm going to be using swing eighth notes a lot more commonly than swing quarter notes, which is why I had 3 of those there and just 1 of these here. Now, in addition to the 5 open outputs for the quarter note for the buffered mult, I'm using 3 more of the outputs to be able to drive the last part of my pulse circuit, which is right over here. So it's driving a Depfer clock divider number 1, which is going to give me a lot of common and easy subdivisions. So, you know, half notes, whole notes, 2 bars, 4 bars, 8 bars, 16 bars. And it also connects into a clock sequencer, which continuously strobes between notes, between these 8 sequences every time that it gets a pulse. So I'll be able to grab those in order to be able to add accents in different places where I want. I also have it driving a clock divider 2, which I bought because I love the fact that it does prime numbers and all sorts of odd numbers and things, which is going to be really interesting for me. So these make up the slower divisions of the beat from the quarter note pulse. And then finally, the last piece here is a clock multiplier, the A160-5, which only has 1 output, but it allows me to be able to get anything from eighth notes up to brrr notes, you know, 128th notes, 16th notes, 16 times 4, so 64th notes, which just sound like a blur. So enough of the theory, let's actually go and build it now, and I'll show you how it all works. And here we are looking at the real thing. So you can see that the upper corner of my live case has got all of the pulses in it. If you want to find out more about that, go to episode 3 of this series if you haven't seen it, and you'll see what my layout plan is for this whole thing. But to look through the pieces first, we start with a Pamela's workout, then a Depfer A-162 dual trigger delay. That's followed by an IntelliGel OR module, a little passive thing, followed by a Synth buffered mult. It's an MST buffered mult that I built. Then the A160 clock divider, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64 divisions, followed by the A161 clock sequencer, which sequences around and around and around as the clock divider gets pulses in, followed by the clock divider 2, which is the unit that I picked up because I like all of the weird divisions that it can make. And then finally, a clock multiplier, the Mult-Ratch controller, the A160-5. So let's start at the beginning by listening to the trigger outputs that Pamela is going to give us. So, tempo of 120, hit start, there's our pulses. That first pulse is a quarter note. That's going to be our fundamental pulse for the whole system. Then, eighth notes, followed by eighth note triplets, followed by 16th notes. Okay, so far so good. Now is where it gets a little trickier. This is where we're going to use the 5, 6, 7, and 8 in order to be able to create the swing circuits. So if we hear 5, it just sounds like a half note. And if we hear 6, sounds like a half note. But if you take a look at the 2 LEDs, one or the other is going off at the pulsive quarter notes. And then the same thing here with 7 and 8. We have quarter notes and quarter notes, but they are offset from each other by half a beat, the result being that they're doing that. So let's actually hear what the result of that is. So I'm going to take output 5, which is going to be the first part of our quarter note swing, and I'm going to stick it here into the OR. Then I'm going to take output 6, and stick it into the trigger delay, then I'm going to output the trigger delay into the OR as well. So now what that means is when this pulse or this pulse is playing, then give us a pulse. And so let's listen to what that sounds like. So if we plug into the bottom of that, so when we start with this swing circuit with zero delay, it just sounds like straight quarter notes. But then as we start to move the delay up, we can start hearing the swing as every other beat gets delayed. So you can get some pretty strange. Once you get it delayed too far, then it's delayed as much as the onset of the next beat, so then it just gets kind of weird. But back midnight and below, dun dun, and then back to straight. Okay, so now let's do the same thing with our eighth notes. So we're going to grab one of the quarter notes, put it into the OR circuit, grab the eighth note, the other eighth note, or the quarter note that's being offset, stick it into the trigger delay, and then stick that into the OR circuit. And now what we should be able to get out the other end, so we have straight eighth notes until once again we operate the delay. So I'm going to start turning this up. So cool, and you can hear all of the musical uses that could have, and having that manually available by a knob like that really allows you to be able to dial in your groove. Okay, so moving on, so now we've got the swing circuit and this thing. Let's get our mults set up. So we're going to go to our master, which as I said is our quarter note pulse, and we're going to stick it into the top of our buffered mult here. Now, if I don't put anything into the other input, then what that means is that this will be available to all of these. I will stick something into the inputs down there so that those pulses will be available separately, but I will have quarter note pulses going to all of these. So let's take advantage of that by using this quarter note pulse to drive the clocks of our other pieces. So here is one copy of it that's going into the A160 clock divider, and you can see that it starts moving and the clock sequencer starts moving. Then the next copy of the quarter note pulse is going to go into our clock divider 2, and you can see that it's starting to go. And then finally the next copy is going to go into our clock multiplier. So we'll listen to what each of these do as well. Okay, so we can hear that we're getting half notes right there on the first clock divider, whole notes, and then the divisions are going to be every 2 bars, every 4 bars, every 8 bars, and every 16 bars. So for brevity's sake, we won't stick around to listen to all of those, but we can also see here on the clock sequencer that we have a separate one of these triggering going through a cycle of 8 every quarter note. So we'll plug it into there, into 3, and we can see that it fires off there, which can certainly be useful for other things. Now, let's go over here and have a listen to these clock divisions. Again, we're not going to listen to the really slow ones, but 3, that should be creating quarter note triplets. This is half notes. Yep. And now the most fun is being able to speed things up. So we're going to go over here to the ratcheting controller, where it starts with eighth notes, so it's multiplying the quarter note in 2, so it's getting eighth notes. We've got a number of different things we can do here. So we can turn it all the way off. Quarter notes, eighth notes, triplets, sixteenths, quintuplets, sextuplets, septuplets, and octuplets, I think it's called. No, what am I talking about? It's going to be 30-second notes. So once we move that up, you can hear that it just gets out of the range of being notes in any way. It just becomes a blur. It just becomes like feels like it's almost getting up to audio rate at that point. So, of course, the thing to note is these are just the pulses. These are not considered to be rhythms by themselves at all. The whole idea here is that these are then going to drive other sequencers, which are going to pick some of these pulses to be able to trigger other musical events. But, you know, in certain circumstances, we actually can use these just the way they are. Okay, now I just have these pulses driving two things, a kick drum sound and a hi-hat sound. This is the kick drum. It's just a straight quarter note coming out of my quarter note bay right there. And then I am pulling in the hi-hat sound from the clock multiplier just to be able to see what we can do to have some fun with this. So we can... It sounds much cooler when it's being compared to a quarter note. Seven against the bar. 7 against the beat. Minutes of fun. Now let's quickly have a listen to the eighth note. Let's quickly have a listen to the eighth note swing. I forgot to plug in the eighth note, straight eighth note, and the swing eighth note into the mult, but I will fix that right now. All right. So now these two give us straight eighths and swing eighths respectively. All right, so there's our straight eighth notes against the quarter note. Now let's start swinging it. Big fun. And then one more thing. Let's use the triggers from our clock sequencer to accent the bass drum. So these are all straight. There we go. 6, 7, 8. Boom. Do, 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 do. And you can imagine, of course, we could pull multiple ones of these if we wanted. We could, if we took this one and that one and multed them together, we would have accents every bar instead of every 2 bars. The possibilities just with straight pulses, without even getting sequences in, are pretty limitless. There's an awful lot of fun you can have. You could have even more fun if you put a couple of logic devices here, some ands and nors and ors. You can even create beats that way without having sequences at all. And we'll have to save that for another time, but that would be an awful lot of fun as well. The purpose of this episode was to look at the rhythmic underpinning to modular synthesizers and how we can use it to add some subtlety and power to our live performance rig. If we want to make any music on the modular beyond evolving drones and bleeps and bloops, we need to concentrate on creating the physical foundations of our rhythmic abilities on this instrument. In order to speak in some depth on the topic, I started out with my apologies to our dearly departed Professor Hawking with a brief history of musical time. For some, that material is undoubtedly old hat, but for other electronic musicians it may be the first time that you've run into these terms, and for others it may be a good refresher. If you're interested in expanding your knowledge of rhythm and musical time, I think there might be more than a few useful resources out there on the internets. We then applied that rhythmic knowledge to modulars, thinking abstractly about pulse as the underlying structure of most electronic music, what kind of devices you can use as your master clock, and how you can derive related metrical divisions through the use of clock multipliers and clock dividers. We then talked about the notion of the resolution of analog sequencers, what value pulses you could use to drive them, and how there is a trade-off between the length of your sequences and their rhythmic complexity. Finally, we got down to business and took a look at the clock layout for my modular. I use a Pamela's Workout as my master clock because it does a ton of the work of creating pulse streams for me. I can assign different subdivisions to the 8 output jacks, saving a lot of room and hassle. We looked at how the pulse streams can be distributed using mults, and how streams can be combined by using logical OR gates. This comes in handy when wanting to adjust the amount of swing on the fly, which you can do by creating 2 pulse streams that are offset from each other, sending one through a delay, and then recombining them. After that, we looked at accents and how they define the meter of the rhythm, then used them to listen to some odd time signatures. We then listened to multiple pulse streams of the same meter working together, and finished up with listening to the ever-changing nature of polyrhythms and polymeters. After going through this deep dive, you may be saying to yourself, forget it, I'm just going to buy a grids or a circadian rhythms or an external drum machine and be done with it. Well, you can certainly do that, and the beauty of this art is that you can intermix anything you want along those lines. I'm not a purist at all. As you'll see in this series, I'll be intermingling sequenced rhythms with some helping hands from the Turing machine and a Euclidean rhythm generator. It's really whatever works for you to help you get the sound that you hear within yourself out to the rest of us. I hope that this episode provided some food for thought along those lines. So that's it for this episode of Under the Big Tree. If you like, join the conversation by sharing your thoughts and experiences on this topic in the comments below. As always, if you like what we're doing here on Under the Big Tree, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. For now, this is Nick, signing off.